It's the last day of school. Can you believe that? You guys are officially fourth graders by the time you watch this. I just got out of our staff final meeting and we watched the school slideshow, which you guys will be seeing very soon, I'm sure. If you don't see it, post it on Facebook or sent through an email. I will share it with you guys next week. I still have to work next week, but this is my final day with you guys. Um, Man, meeting with the entire staff was I had chills the entire time, and it's just sad that we have to end this way, and it's like frustrating. Miss Simon is retiring, as you know, and so I brought my big Simon head to the meeting, but she just was sharing her emotions with us, and she's so sad to have to leave, and I'm so sad to see her go. She's somebody who made me smile every time at school, every time I got to see her at school. So I sent your parents an email today because they're rock stars for helping you through this. They're not teachers, most of them, and for them to have to work and teach you guys at home, that was a lot. So make sure you let them know that you're grateful for them. I sent them an email and I sent a list of books that I have heard are really amazing and why I think you might like them. So on the reading recommendations that I sent out, it'll say something like, if you love Big Nate and graphic novels, here's some books you might like. Or if you love books about fantasy and dragons, here's some great books that you might like. So check that out. I know it's hard right now because a lot of us can't get to the library, but if you have some money saved up and you want to order some books, or you want to get on Epic, or you can still order through Scholastic. The books are taking a little longer than normal, but we still get points for our classroom library. So let me know if you need help with that. Keep reading this summer. Make reading fun. Make reading comfortable. Get a beach towel out and go out and lay down with a book. Find a cozy, shady spot to lay with a book. Listen to books more. When I'm out working in the garden, I have a book on tape playing. When I'm going to bed at night, I listen to a book for 5 to 10 minutes. Listening to books is part of reading as well. Okay, be immersed in stories. I can't express that enough to you. Speaking of stories, I'll get to it. Edward Tulane. I had technical difficulties yesterday. My computer is like shutting down because it has gotten more screen time than it's ever gotten. And I don't have Mr. Baker to help me. But I didn't get to read any Edward Tulane for you guys yesterday. So today I'm reading it. I'm not going to finish it. So you'll have another video next week, and it will be finished. But right now we just met Sarah Ruth, who is sick and is loving on Edward right now. What are they calling him right now? Jangles, right? They're calling him Jangles. All right, chapter 18. Bryce and Sarah Ruth had a father. Oh, this is a pretty difficult part of the book. Early the next morning, when the light was gray and uncertain, Sarah Ruth was sitting up in bed, coughing, and the father came home. He picked Edward up by one of his ears and said, "I ain't never." "It's a baby doll," said Bryce. "Don't look like no baby doll to me." Edward, hanging by one ear, was frightened. This, he was certain, was the man who crushed the heads of china dolls. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth between coughs. She held out her arms. "He's hers," said Bryce. "He belongs to her." The father dropped Edward on the bed, and Bryce picked up the rabbit and handed him to Sarah Ruth. "It don't matter anyway," said the father. "It don't make no difference, none of it." "It does so matter," says Bryce. "Don't you sass me," said the father. He raised his hand and slapped Bryce across his mouth, and then He raised his hand and slapped Bryce across his mouth, and then he turned and left the house. "You ain't got to worry about him," said Bryce to Edward. "He ain't nothing but a bully, and besides, he don't hardly ever come home." Fortunately, the father did not come back that day. Bryce went out to work, and Sarah Ruth spent the day in bed, holding Edward in her lap and playing with a box filled with buttons. "Pretty," she said to Edward as she lined up the buttons on the bed and arranged them into different patterns. Sometimes, when a coughing fit was particularly bad, she squeezed Edward so tight that he was afraid he would crack in two. Also, in between coughing fits, she took to sucking on one or the other of Edward's ears. Normally, Edward would have found intrusive, clingy behavior of this sort really annoying, but there was something about Sarah Ruth. He wanted to take care of her. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to do more for her. And at the end of the day, Bryce returned with a biscuit for Sarah Ruth and a ball of twine for Edward. Sarah Ruth held the biscuit in both hands and took small, tentative bites. "You eat that all up, honey. Let me hold Jangles," said Bryce. "Him and me got a surprise for you." Bryce took Edward off in a corner of the room, and with his pocket knife he cut off lengths of twine and tied them to Edward's arms and feet, and then tied the twine to sticks of wood. "See? All day I've been thinking about it," Bryce said. "What we're going to do is make you dance. Sarah Ruth loves dancing. Mama used to hold on to her and dance around the room." "You eating that biscuit?" Bryce called out to Sarah Ruth. "Uh-huh," said Sarah Ruth. "Hold on, honey. We got a surprise for you." Bryce stood up. "Close your eyes," he told her. He took Edward over to the bed and said, "Okay, open them now." Sarah Ruth opened her eyes. "Dance, Jangles," said Bryce, and then, moving the strings with the sticks with one hand, Bryce made Edward dance and drop and sway, and the whole while at the same time with his other hand he held on to the harmonica and played a bright and lovely tune. Have you guys ever seen a marionette, like Pinocchio, like a dancing puppet? That's what he's doing. Sarah Ruth laughed. She laughed until she started to cough, and then Bryce laid Edward down and took Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her and rubbed her back. "You want some fresh air?" he asked her. "Let's get you out of this nasty old air, huh?" Bryce carried his sister outside. He left Edward lying on the bed and the rabbit staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling. He left Edward lying in the bed, and the rabbit, staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling, thought again about having wings. If he had them, he thought he would fly high above the world to where the air was clear and sweet. He would take Sarah Ruth with him. He would carry her in his arms, surely so high above the world that she would be able to breathe without coughing. After a minute, Bryce came back inside, still carrying Sarah Ruth. "She wants you, too," he said. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth. She held out her arms. So Bryce held Sarah Ruth, and Sarah Ruth held Edward, and the three of them stood outside. Bryce said, "You got to look for fallen stars. Them's are the one with magic." Stars is something that keeps being brought over and over again. Edward stares up at the stars. A lot of times when he's alone, a lot of times when he's had to move on to someone else. And now Bryce is bringing up stars. What do you think the importance of the stars are? You got to look for the falling stars. Them are the ones with magic. They were quiet for a long time, all three of them looking up at the sky. Sarah Ruth stopped coughing. Edward thought that maybe she had fallen asleep. "There," she said, as she pointed to a star streaking through the night sky. "Make a wish, honey," Bryce said, his voice high and tight. "That's your star. You make a wish for anything that you want." And even though it was Sarah Ruth's star, Edward wished on it too. Chapter 19. The days passed, the sun rose and set again and again, and sometimes the father came home and sometimes he did not. Edward's ears became soggy and he did not care. His sweater had almost completely unraveled and it didn't bother him. He was hugged half to death and it felt good. In the evenings at the hands of Bryce, at the ends of the twine, Edward danced and danced and danced. 1 month passed, and then 2, and then 3. Sarah Ruth only got worse. In the 5th month, she refused to eat. And in the 6th month, she began to cough up blood. Her breathing became ragged and uncertain, as if she was trying to remember in between breaths what to do, what breathing was. "Breathe, honey," Bryce stood over her and said. "Breathe," thought Edward from deep inside the well of her arms. "Please, please breathe." Bryce stopped leaving the house. He sat at home all day and held Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her back and forth and sang to her. And on a bright morning in September, Sarah Ruth stopped breathing. "Oh, no," said Bryce. "Oh, honey, take a little breath, please." Edward had fallen out of Sarah Ruth's arms the night before, and she had not asked for him again. So, face down on the floor, arms over his head, Edward listened as Bryce wept. He listened as the father came home and shouted at Bryce. He listened as the father wept. "You can't cry," Bryce shouted. "You got no right to cry. You never even loved her. You don't know nothing about love." "I loved her," said the father. "I loved her." "I loved her too," thought Edward. "I loved her and now she's gone." How could this be, he wondered. How could he bear to live in a world without Sarah Ruth? The yelling between the father and son continued, and there was a terrible moment when the father insisted that Sarah Ruth belonged to him, that she was his girl, his baby, and that he was taking her to be buried. "She ain't yours," Bryce screamed. "You can't take her. She ain't yours." But the father was bigger and stronger, and he prevailed. He wrapped Sarah Ruth in a blanket and carried her away. The small house became very quiet. Edward could hear Bryce moving around, muttering to himself, and then finally, the boy picked Edward up. "Come on, Jangles," Bryce said. "We're leaving. We're going to Memphis." Chapter 20. How sad. "How many dancing rabbits have you seen in your life?" Bryce said to Edward. "I can tell you how many I've seen. One. You. That's how you and me are going to make some money. I seen it the last time I was in Memphis. Folks put on any kind of show right there on the street corner, and people pay 'em for it. I seen it." The walk to town took all night. Bryce walked without stopping, carrying Edward under one arm and talking to him the whole time. Edward tried to listen, but the terrible scarecrow feeling had come back. That feeling he had when he was hanging by his ears in the old lady's garden. The feeling that nothing mattered and that nothing would ever matter again. And not only did Edward feel hollow, he ached. Every part of his china body ached. He ached for Sarah Ruth. He wanted her to hold him. He wanted to dance for her. And he did dance, but it was not for Sarah. Edward danced for strangers on a dirty street corner in Memphis. Bryce played his harmonica and moved Edward's strings, and Edward bowed and shuffled and swayed, and people stopped to stare and point and laugh. And on the ground in front of them was Sarah Ruth's button box. The lid was open to encourage people to drop change inside of it. "Mama," said a small child, "look at that bunny. I want to touch him." He reached out his hand for Edward. "No," said the mother. "Dirty." She pulled her child back, away from Edward. "Nasty," she said. A man wearing a hat stopped and stared at Edward and Bryce. "It's a sin to dance," he said, and then after a long pause, he said, "It's a particular sin for rabbits to dance." The man took off his hat and held it over his heart. He stood and watched the boy and the rabbit for a long time. Finally, he put his hat back on his head and walked away. The shadows lengthened. The sun became an orange dusty ball low in the sky. Bryce started to cry. Edward saw his tears land on the pavement, but the boy did not stop playing his harmonica. He did not make Edward stop dancing. An old woman leaning on a cane stepped up close to them. She stared at Edward with deep, dark eyes. "Pellegrina," thought the dancing rabbit. She nodded at him. Look at me," he said to her. His arms and legs jerked. "Look at me. You got your wish. I have learned how to love. It's a terrible thing. I'm broken. My heart is broken. Help me." The old woman turned and hobbled away. "Come back," thought Edward. "Fix me." Bryce cried harder. He made Edward dance faster. Finally, when the sun was gone and the streets were dark, Bryce stopped playing his harmonica. "I'm done now," he said. He let Edward fall to the pavement. "I ain't going to cry anymore." Bryce wiped his nose, his eyes with the back of his hand, and he picked up the button box and looked inside of it. "We got us enough money to get something to eat," he said. "Come on, Jangles." And that's where we'll stop today. All right. I know it's your last day of schoolwork, but we're not done because I'm going to finish that book with you. So I will be sharing it with you next week. But enjoy the weekend. It is Memorial Day weekend. I hope you get outside, whether it's at home or on a hike or somewhere. I'm sure parks will be pretty crowded. So stay safe, stay healthy. Reach out to me if you need me. I'll be here all summer. Love you tons. See ya.